Hey guys, welcome to book review number 130. Today I am going to be reviewing Kaleidoscope City, a year in Varanasi. Um, Varanasi is the famous holy city in India. It's along the banks of the Ganges. And the author, I forgot to mention, Piers Eddy, if that's how you pronounce his name, spent a year there. And his book is really not extensive, but much like the Moshikari treats, which I believe, no, the Misthai treats, which are like little desserts that are very famous, little sugary desserts are famous from the city. This book is really a picture of Varanasi. It covers kind of some of the key aspects of the city, that being that it is a holy city. It's a city where people go to die. It's sort of, I don't know if you compare it to like a holy pilgrimage site within Europe, or maybe like Mecca would be a very similar example for the Islamic community. But specifically, as India is known to have many famous holy sites, it focuses on death, which is obviously one of the most important things within any religion. But that's what the city is all about. Specifically, it has these ghats or Hindu holy temples that line the Ganges River. And interesting side note, the Ganges, this is the only part in the Ganges where it flows north, giving it auspicious signs after it comes out of the Himalayas. So, what are the contents? Well, we have, as I mentioned, the when Piers Eddy was at the ghats, he was talking to the cremators. These ghats are famous for kind of lining the Ganges River and then having platforms and steps that lead down to the river itself. So it's a very sort of man-made riverbank. And the riverbank is man-made specifically so that funeral pyres or cremation grounds can happen along them so that the people of the Hindu faith can be reincarnated auspiciously. Well, I think it actually even says in the book that they're not reincarnated. They reach a point of, I forget what they specifically refer to it as, but the equivalent of nirvana, where they don't need to be reincarnated, where they become, one with the holy being of the world, if you will. Gaia, as they might say. Let's see, what else? Search for Rama Kaptor. They talked a lot, some about these festivals that they would have, specifically related to and it's really bad if I don't remember this, the Ramakara, which I believe is the oldest of the Indian holy texts, and how that in the city they would have these big festivals where they would recreate them. And specifically, he mentioned how the actors were seeing, we say in the West that actors inhabit a character, but in this specific instance, they're almost seeing, the way that I saw it is sort of like in the Catholic Church, you have the Eucharist, and then you have the transubstantiation, which is different from a lot of Protestant churches where it actually believes that, the body of Christ, or which, if you will, inhabits the Eucharistic communion. Well, in this case, the gods themselves inhabit the actors. They're not merely portraying, but they're rather themselves, and the actors are merely conduits for what these gods represent. And he also mentioned that something kind of interesting. Ooh, there's my foot. Was the kids that played along in the play and how reverend they were. Sex for Sale. He talks about the extensive efforts of campaign to get sex work out of Varanasi, or specifically bring it to justice. Let's see if I can find it. Yeah, here we go. Sangita, I believe is his name. Or is it Egg? No, it's Egg Jet. Who is very famous for kind of almost single-handedly or single-mindedly taking on a problem that really most likely has no solution. It's sort of like a drop in the bucket of the, or drop in the ocean almost, of the problem of prostitution within India. And he specifically mentioned, let's see if I can't find her name. He mentions a woman that they met up with that it doesn't really say the woman's name. Maybe it's for the best. Something that's interesting, and you see this all over the world, but particularly within the grinding poverty of India, is the sex workers are kept under economic strain in order to keep them in line or keep them in the industry. You know, if they had a choice or an economic alternative, a lot of these women would choose otherwise, but because they're so sort of entangled in economic struggle, they essentially can't. And it's an easy thing to dismiss. Well, why don't they just go get a job? But if you look at the sort of economic situation for a lot of these women in India, there really is no alternative, and it's very sad that they have to divert to means to this measure. And it's also should be mentioned that it's not like some sort of high-end prostitution. Not that that's great in the United States, but these women, even when they are prostitutes, are still essentially confined to the life that they lead, if you will. Let's see, what else? I think he talks about the treats. It's kind of an interesting contrast between the Mathai shop, and he talks about some of the treats that the city, the culinary delights that the city is famous for. I think he mentions a couple of them, but specifically the thing that they export all over India and even into the Western world for Indian Americans or Indian Europeans, are these things called Mithai. I think it's pronounced Mathai sweets. And kind of what's interesting about them is that because they're only sort of ghee, which is a clarified butter, and sugar, and maybe some sort of like flour or some sort of starch, I think, or yeah, some sort of bulgur. I'm not exactly sure. They can essentially take on the shape of anything, and so you get these artistic creations that range from just your basic level street food all the way up to hundreds of dollars. I think maybe you mentioned like the showpieces might even get thousands of dollars for these elaborate confections, dessert confections. And something else that he mentioned was that the flavoring is not necessarily what we'd expect in the West. There's a lot more sort of savory flavors involved. Though they are all sweet in a sense, there's, different, it's not just a sweet taste, it's sort of a mixture of tastes in a sweet confectionery treat. He mentions the ganja. Let's see. What does he say about the ganja? Let me turn to page 97. Haven't really had this too well organized, but I guess it is, it is what it is. Oh yeah, this is where he talks about the boat riders, and specifically the effects that, oh yeah, he talks about the boat riders, and he talks about the environmental cleanup of the Ganges River. The boat riders being another traditional caste, kind of having a strain on the way of their life, considering mechanization has happened. considering that the Ganges is much more polluted than what it used to be. These people used to be confined to their caste but live fairly steady lives to the degree that you can in India, in that the river provided fish for them, the banks of the shore with the floodwaters coming in and out provided vegetables and crops for them. Transportation by boat provided employment, but with changes in modernization, specifically with factories occurring upriver, there's a lot more pollution. But interestingly enough, a lot of the fight between the boatmen happens not with the plants themselves, though they certainly like to decrease pollution, but actually with the environmentalists, because the environmentalists want to put constraints not merely on the big polluters, but also on like multi-source pollution, which is like small or even everyday pollution that individuals contribute to the river, and are therefore fighting the boatmen themselves. It's very fascinating. Later in the chapter, he meets with the founder of this environmental movement, whose name is, let's see, Veer Bandra Mashashi. Yeah. I'm just going to call him Veer, who is kind of a little bit disenchanted by the author, Piers. He gave Veer great credit for the work that he achieved, but in the individual interview, Veer had become very cynical about the prospects of the river. He still fought the good fight, but essentially saw it as a lost cause, that he was just too overwhelmed. And Veer had a big organization behind him, but just in relative comparison to the polluters or the new India that was coming about, he just felt overwhelmed. He also mentioned that I believe the granddaughter of Gandhi was a premier, or the president of India in the late 80s, I believe, and there was this ambitious new clean up the Ganges campaign, as you hear the sirens behind me, that was looking to clean up the Ganges River, but essentially, while it had an auspicious start, it was directly supported by the government. It had, direct governmental momentum behind it. This granddaughter of Gandhi was assassinated, and although pollution levels have cleaned up marginally since the 1980s, it really feels like the environmental effort in India has kind of left it behind, at least as per the publishing time of this book, and that there's just a lot, it doesn't have the momentum that it did quite a bit ago. Let's see, the warp and the weft. Oh, that interestingly talks about the garment making industry in India. And what I thought was interesting was there'd always been a divide between sort of like the artisan or the craft, high-end craft, textile or clothing makers within India, and sort of your everyday clothes makers. But what has really happened since mechanization is that because the artisans can market themselves as artisans, they can essentially sell their wares not only in India but sort of on an international market as handmade, sort of like what you see a lot in the hipster movement in the United States. And so they've really kind of survived, in a way, even thrived. They're largely Muslims, the Ansaris, which is interesting because it's the exact name of Aziz Ansari, the famous comedian, who is also Muslim Indian. So I wonder if he's kind of related to this caste, if you will. And they're very clean. He mentioned that the compound that this place was in stark contrast to the sort of muddied, I want to say polluted, grimy exterior street life that surrounded this compound where they made all these cloths. And it really was a very sort of stern environment, but an environment that was a very sort of religiously observant environment, kind of not in an extremist way, but just in a very sort of pious way for these Muslim textile makers within India. And that contrasted greatly to the street scene outside. And it also contrasted greatly to the textile makers that were sort of in the lower end. I believe they're called the Barashi or something like that. But they really are hurting, and there were even mentions in the book of suicide by people that were in this caste, essentially because mechanized textile making, specifically within China, had essentially lost them their jobs, that they could no longer compete with these people. And although there were still a few customers, there weren't enough customers for these low-end handmade textiles to prevent the caste from going into deep economic decline. And of course, caste being very important in India, it's much harder to move from industry to industry within the caste of India, particularly within the lower castes, where you don't have as much connection or opportunity. So there was really despair sort of in that community. Okay, the city of 10,000 widows that talks about, I mentioned along the Ganges, is the city of death, where people go to die, people go where their funeral pyres so that they can go in the Ganges. And this chapter sort of mentions the widow problem within India, that a lot of women, after their husbands died, came to this city in order to die themselves. India being a much more patriarchal society, women have power, but they only have power, and they have power to say what they want to with their husband, but it's still within the context of marriage. It's still within the context of traditional caste lines. So when a husband dies, essentially the widow's life is seen as over. And there's really sort of, what do they say, I think 2 options or 3 options. 3 options, yes. One is to marry the younger brother of the widower. One is to commit suicide. And the third one is to essentially just become a non-member of society. And that's what this chapter is largely about. It's about the women that chose the third option, to come to Varanasi in order to die. And how he goes, the author goes to a Dutch charity organization that has a dormitory that keeps a small sliver. I mean, we're talking tens of thousands, maybe hundreds of thousands of widowers that come to the city, and they keep a dormitory of 50 of these women or 100 of these women. But they essentially keep them from off the streets, which is what you often see in Varanasi, is these women who are widowers who have really nothing to their name, come to the city to die. And it's really quite sad, but charity organizations such as this provide hope. And also really what they talk about is how there are some select industries, sort of cottage industries or cottage crafts, that these women can get into to earn a marginal living in order to feel. It's not even so much about the money, though the widows obviously need that. They live in grinding poverty, but some of it, at least in this one organization, is provided by the charity. But it provides sort of a meaning beyond merely the life with their husbands. Let's see, harmony, rhythm, and order. And that's the last chapter in the book. Let me see how long I'm going on here. I'm over 20 minutes. I gotta get going. That book is about a tradition, or that chapter, this chapter, is about a specific, particular type of music that's played. And Piers interviews the woman that's famous for this type of thing, and she says that it's dying out in the face of modern encroachment, modern pop music, but Piers still finds it very haunting, the few notes and melodies that he gives her, or that she gives him, excuse me. So overall thoughts, yeah, this is a good book. As I mentioned, even though I've gone kind of long, It's a very slim book. I think I read this in a few days. And it really gives kind of a very slim, I keep saying slim as if it's an insult, it's not an insult, but a very precise, on point analysis of some of the aspects. And I'm sure there are other aspects that he didn't cover, but I think he did a good job in covering what the tick of the city is, rather than trying to cover every single aspect of the city. So yeah, he really gets to the point, and really, this is a treat, a little delicatessen, a little dessert of a little sugary piece of what the grand, grinding, crazy, lovable, unique city of Varanasi is. All right, Kaleidoscope City, A Year in Varanasi by Piers. Check it out, you guys, and check out some more of my reviews later. All right, I'll see you.